We have Ken Hui from Rackspace.
Oh, good to hear.
And Patrick Riley, who is the founder and former CEO of Kismatic, involved in Kubernetes. Awesome.
Yep.
So the idea behind this panel happened in a hallway track at an open source conference. Stop me if you've heard this before. We were talking to some folks, and you know, these guys came up and said, "Oh, you work for that company. Oh, well, you must be involved in this open source project. God, it's a tire fire." And then someone else says, "Yeah, but not as much as what you're involved in because that is just impossible." And so I said, "Wait, we've all been involved in open source our whole careers. What are y'all doing to fix it? Are y'all involved in the community, or are you just kind of parroting what you see in blog posts, or have you actually contributed code upstream? Have you helped with documentation? Have you, put in bugs and issues?" So that's kind of how it all got started. And so Ken, I'll let you do like a quick intro of yourself, and same for Patrick. And
yeah, so thanks, Kim. My name's Ken Hui. I'm currently doing technical marketing on OpenStack over at Rackspace. I'm also an OpenStack user group organizer for New York and Philadelphia, and I'm also part of the OpenStack Foundation's ambassadors team. Basically, my job is to try to help organize and start user groups all over the country.
Awesome.
Hi, I'm Patrick Riley. I'm the former CEO of Kismatic, the enterprise Kubernetes company that sold to Apprenda. Before that, I sold my company Orly Atomics to Mesosphere. So the original core team around Mesosphere with my old employees. So I love open source, and I love getting people to participate in open source, not just talk negatively about it.
Yes. And my background is started out around a bunch of folks doing JBoss and Spring in Atlanta, and then most recently Cloud Foundry and OpenStack. So I guess the big question is, what is the number one you feel like issue that people say is a problem in the community? We can go high level and maybe branch off from there.
Well,
with the project.
Yeah, I think...
No pressure, man, no pressure.
I know.
It's all you.
So obviously, most of my involvement's in the OpenStack community, and there's no shortage of complaints about the community. I think probably one of the top problems is that the community is so big and it's so diverse that you're always going to find people who say, the community isn't doing this to make my life easier, or they're going this direction. I don't know why they would want to go in this direction. So I think it's as a open source community grows and more people get involved, it just becomes impossible to try to satisfy every person's needs or requirements. But I don't know if people always realize that. They always think my problem is the one problem that OpenStack should try to solve. And I don't know why they're bothering with anything else.
Yeah. How about you?
I really struggle. I don't know how to answer that question. I think one thing I would say is that, open source, we're talking about open source communities, it really is a community. You have to participate, and there's many ways that you can participate. Like the other day, I was at the Kubernetes meetup in San Francisco, and the comment was made by one of the presenters that, Kubernetes is really hard, the documentation sucks. And I'm like, well, you are using it, so why don't you contribute to making the documentation suck less? And so if you're going to make the comment, also like follow up and fix, the thing. And there's a lot of low-level grunt work that can be done on any of these projects, to make them better. You see a typo, just fix it. Like we're all using, version control. It's easy to do that. If you could figure out how to sign a CLA for OpenStack, you could probably do that.
I do think one of the challenges, though, is that there's so many more people getting involved in open source now than ever before, and so many folks are new to the open source world. I think, particularly, enterprise users kind of come with an expectation that things like documentations, it's already finished before they try to consume the product. And so they come into the community thinking, why isn't the document already fixed? They don't, I think people are still trying to embrace this idea that, like you said, open source is a community, which means we're all involved in making it better. It's not one or two companies that has to solve all the problems.
And Kubernetes is only 2 years old. Let's remember that. I mean, there's leaps and bounds have been made just in those 2 years, like significantly more than most projects. So what else? It's what do you commonly hear when you're doing your meetups and people or you're talking to other people that run
Yeah.
other meetups?
I think one of the things, I kind of got back to the theme of, I think people are used to the idea that I'm consuming a product.
Yeah.
I always I've been talking for years that there's a difference between, in terms of OpenStack, and I think maybe in some ways can apply to Kubernetes as well, there's a difference between OpenStack the project, OpenStack the product, and OpenStack the service, right? And I think what happens, a lot of people have expectations of a project that it should be the same, or as polished and as finished as a product would be, and not realize that part of what makes an open source project great is that actually it's not all finished. That is there's things that are ongoing and innovating, and it's some other companies are trying to productize those things. And so I think so a lot of it's just expectations of what a project should deliver versus what a product or a service should deliver.
And I think as we see projects mature over time, you look at like the Apache web server, like there's very few people actually day-to-day participating in that community because it doesn't need as much care and feeding. So the example I always try to use when we talk about open source projects is kind of like a bonsai tree. It takes a lot of care, a lot of pruning, a lot of like willingness to say, that looks beautiful, but I want to try it again. I'm going to cut that away. I'm going to refactor this, and constantly giving back until you get to that point where it's stable. Like if I look at my the Mesos community that I was very involved with before Kubernetes, it's a much more stable community. The changes, they've gotten to a 1.0 release. Like things are kind of the way they're going to be for a while. Where Kubernetes, there's still a lot of things in flight. There's still a lot of features that are going to be added. So it's kind of different momentum. And it's a cycle, and it's important that people, realize that and like participate at the right time. Like it's much easier to get a feature into Kubernetes now than it would be to get a feature into Mesos, for example.
Gotcha. So how do you feel like, so the way that the open source community is structured, so say a foundation versus a company-driven, organized way, how do you feel like that is a good thing for OpenStack, and how do you feel like maybe that's not as good of a thing for OpenStack?
Yes. So when you have a project that only one or two where one company is the spearhead, I think you can argue that it's easier to keep quality control because there aren't as many hands involved, as many different opinions. The downside, obviously, is you don't get as much participation, and you're only getting that one company's point of view. I think the thing that I've really loved about OpenStack is how diverse and large the community is. And so we get a lot of great ideas. That's one of the big upsides. That's also one of the big downsides,
Right.
which is it's sometimes when you go to an OpenStack design summit and to hear people talk about their ideas, it doesn't sound like a unified project. It sounds like a lot of sounds like the Republican convention. It's a lot of competing fractions,
Please
right?
tweet that everyone.
We didn't just say it was political, I promise.
Just as an analogy, right? So I think one of the downsides of having so many companies involved is that at the end of the day, however altruistic a company may seem, at the end of the day, their job is to make money,
Right.
which means they have to sell something. And so if you're I remember a couple of summits ago, I kind of made a controversial statement, which was I said, what the thing that's making OpenStack not work as well as it should as a cloud, it's all the hardware companies that are involved. And I said that mainly because I felt like there was a trend where a lot of the hardware vendors, especially on the storage side, were so focused on making sure their product plugs in that weren't really focused on how to make the whole core better. And I think that's one of the issues that the foundation still has to deal with, which is how do we get 200 companies to agree to not only try to make their product work best in OpenStack, but that they try to make OpenStack itself a much better project.
Right.
I think on my side, in the Kubernetes community, the thing I hear time and time again now is like, let's not be another OpenStack. Let's learn some lessons from that community. So as the Cloud Native Computing Foundation has been created, the IP for Kubernetes is now in that foundation. We're trying to make smart decisions and kind of look at all the other communities, not just OpenStack, and see what worked and what didn't, as we make decisions, there.
And the same can be said for Cloud Foundry. When we all first got involved there, Pivotal was definitely a huge driver, and it's definitely more differentiated now. I think the foundation's done a really good job of doing that and helping, really making sure a lot of the vendors have some good say there. So.
Yeah, when I think of the role of a foundation, I wanted to be very additive and supportive of the community and kind of act as that, gateway to people, individuals that can contribute, organizations that can contribute, and make it kind of even weighted amongst them.
Right.
Yeah, but I think one of the challenges of foundations is there's, in a large project, is there are so many different constituencies that they have to balance, right? I mean, it is not, the reality, it isn't always the case that what users want is what vendors want. Sometimes hopefully they converge, sometimes they diverge, and a foundation has to figure out how do I make sure the users get what they need, but how do I make sure that vendors get a voice, because they are part of the community. In fact, I think you look at almost any large open source project, the majority of developers are actually employees of vendors and being paid by those vendors to contribute to that project. So you can't tell vendors, forget what you want, we're only going to focus on users. That's just not realistic.
We get asked by customers a lot which projects inside of OpenStack are ready for us, that kind of thing. So I'm sure you probably get that same question at Rackspace, like when are you going to adopt this project, or when are we going to see that in our, as options? So how do y'all address that?
Do you want to talk about Kubernetes?
And like Kubernetes, I'm sure there's new features that are released. It's a little bit more of a combined project versus OpenStack. There's so many different projects inside of OpenStack now.
Yeah, so after leaving the Mesos community and focusing on Kubernetes from very early stage with Kismatic, a lot of what we were doing was just proof of concept work, showing people that, hey, you can use Kubernetes the same way you were using Mesos. Like, here's how we can do this same kind of dog fooding exercise with one of your apps. So for a long time, it was very cookie cutter. Mm-hmm. And then as other things came along in the community for storage, for networking, kind of bake off those things for people. So we could say like, oh, this is how Calico networking works if you're doing, if you want to do it this way. Here's other Open Contrail, other things that you can use, and kind of being that voice of reason for them and making them feel comfortable, because it's daunting, right? Like when you, especially with newer projects, when you go look at someone's blog post from 2 months ago and it's already out of date, like it's already telling you to do wrong things. Like one of the silly things in the Kubernetes community, we changed the name of the way you interact with the CLI, the actual command that you used. And so you'd see a blog post that was just a month old and it was referencing an old command. So the very first experience someone had with the project was going there and typing that command and being like, command not found. And they're like, what the heck? This thing's a month old. How could you be moving that quickly? So just being cognizant of like helping shepherd people along that learning. And I think in general, as all these communities, we really need to focus on education, because most people are coming at this blind. They don't know, everything that you know. And you think about all the context you build up in your day-to-day that you have and you take for granted. All these other people have none of that. And they're just like, here's this GitHub repo. It may or may not do things.
Yeah, that's a huge point right there.
Yeah. So in terms of like knowing what components or projects in OpenStack are mature, it's a difficult question to answer. I think the foundation's made some strides to help. So the kind of one of the least known things that the foundation has created is something called Project Navigator, which you can find on the website, which basically kind of gives a maturity score to different projects. So you can find out whether a project, if a lot of people are contributing to it, or only a couple, whether it's been in production for some time, or whether it's only been in, or not in production at all. So that's a good way to go. The difficulty is going to be, and I'm going to sound like a vendor a little bit, is how OpenStack should be deployed in any given environment depends on the environment, right? So a good example is at Rackspace, I think it's pretty well known that our public cloud, it's not 100% OpenStack, right? It's got I think it's probably about 80% there, but but there are components we don't use. Like, for example, we don't use Keystone. But we support the APIs, but we don't use the Keystone. Does that mean Keystone isn't a good project and is not ready? Maybe not. It depends, right? Because on the private cloud side, we have customers that are using Keystone all the time. The issue is but on our public cloud side, when you're talking about tens of thousands of servers, what works in a small environment doesn't necessarily work for that environment. So I think it's important not to look at any given project and say because so and so doesn't use it or so and so uses it, that means I can use it. It's probably best to find out what your use case is, and then try to talk to other people in the community who have a similar use case, similar size environment, and say, what are you guys doing, and what are you seeing that works and doesn't work?
Right, and that's what we try to do too. I'm glad we teased that out because there's not one easy answer for that.
And that was one of my frustrations. In my past, I used to be a senior technical advisor at Wikipedia, which is like 4th largest website on the planet. And for our labs environment, we used OpenStack. And we were able to get Cisco to donate a bunch of amazing UCS gear to us to build this labs environment. And it was going to be this like holy grail environment. We got it all up and running. We had Ryan Lane, like one of the people early involved in OpenStack, helping us. And it was amazing until we needed to upgrade. And then it was like, crap, how do we upgrade this thing? And we didn't have, Cisco's like wonderful, gave us all this gear, but they're not going to just keep giving us gear every time we want to upgrade. So that was actually really difficult to figure out, like, kind of the cadence. And then as that labs environment matured, it became very difficult when people would come on and say, well, OpenStack does this thing. Why doesn't your OpenStack cluster do this thing? And it's like, well, what is this thing? We have to go search, and you say, like, oh, okay, well, that's a different type of distributed file system that we could be using that we're not. And even feeling comfortable as the foundation to know which projects to pick. We had Ryan that helped a ton. But even just to get other people in the community, and it was difficult when vendors get involved too, because you have the piston people pushing you this way, other people pushing you this way. It really wasn't until Mirantis came along and kind of gave us a little better repeatability and like look at their blog posts, look at the guidance that they were giving, where we felt more comfortable, with the decision-making process.
And it was one of the things I like about the Kubernetes project is I think. They have been they've been very good about when they have a new feature out, but trying to explain what it does, and helping people understand where it fits. So you can avoid some of the problem of, I'm rolling out 50 features in this new release, and users have no idea which ones are more mature enough for production and which ones aren't.
We're very lucky to have Kelsey Hightower in the community, who's basically
Probably the 8th time
stand-up
he's been
comic.
mentioned too. He's great. He cares about the docs a lot, obviously.
Well, and frankly, one of the things that's really exciting to me about Kubernetes is it's not like it's just Google decided to write this thing because there should be another one of this thing. This is something that they've been doing for 12 plus years internally with Borg and Omega, and it's those very same engineers that were tasked to write this. And I don't know about the people in the room, how many of you are developers, but if you ever had your boss come to you and say, that thing you've been working on for 12 years that you kind of have all these things you don't like about, but you deal with it because it'd be too hard to fix because we use it for like worldwide production. How would you like to rewrite that from scratch in this new language that's way easier to write in? Like, who's going to be like, oh, I'm good. I don't feel like doing that. Thank you. I'll stick with the old painful thing. So obviously it's going to be better. So we have that, even though like you mentioned, the project's only 2 years old. You have 12 plus years of legacy of like actual real world corner cases and hard problems being solved. And so when you show like new features like pet sets and things, like you can actually have a lot of wealth of information about why those are necessary.
Yeah. And I think it's valuable to have, like you said, like a company that's done this, be able to say, we use this feature in this way, and these are the things that you might want to avoid. That's one of the reasons I like being at Rackspace is we have 6 years experience running OpenStack in our public cloud. And one of the things that I'm working on the team on, over the course of the next 6 months to a year, you're going to see Rackspace put out like just volumes of documentation on this is what worked in our public cloud and what didn't work, and how this could help you. So I think having people like Rackspace doing that for OpenStack and people like Google doing that for Kubernetes will only make the projects better and the
Right.
community stronger.
Yeah.
So now we've touched on it a little bit, but final question, what can people do when they complain about an open source project and it's crazy, it's this, it's that, what can they do to jump in and help?
Yeah.
You know, I tell people all the time, like, especially if you're new to a community, like, I started on the PHP project, like, in 1997 as a core developer, and I started sending in, like, some things I hated about PHP by email. I was like, this sucks, this is better in Perl, blah, 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 and I thought I was, like, the coolest dude in the world for being this jerk and sending these things in. And Rasmus wrote back to me, like, awesome, where's the patch? Like, you forgot to attach the patch with your complaint, like, you know, and I'm like, oh, crap. It's like I went back and like started to try to fix these things and realized that they're non-trivial. Like, it's easy for me to complain, but hard for me to write code, you know, to fix it. So it has to be a balance. Like, if you're going to complain about something, offer a solution. And like the last part of that is like, even if you don't know how to code, you know how to write, you know how to read, you know how to provide value, you know how to define a feature. Like, there's tons of things you can do on a project, you know, to help. Like, one of the things I really like about the Kubernetes community is like, before anything goes in, there's like a pretty formal process of like describing what it is you're wanting to do, and you get buy-in before anyone wastes the time writing code. Because it's really difficult on a project, especially in the early days of it, when someone sends you this pull request that's like, you know, the first chapter of the Bible, and you're like, awesome, I'm not going to read that, but thank you for your contribution,
Right.
and it just kind of lingers there. So just small, you know, contributions that add up over time are much better.
Yeah. And to piggyback on, I think it's great. How many of you here are people who could actually write a patch for OpenStack? It's actually probably about half, maybe less than half the room.
Yeah.
So the reality is, I think in the past, we've always said, if there's a problem, don't complain about it, write a patch for it.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is a lot of people, as more people come into the community, that's not really feasible. So one thing I would say is if you do have a complaint and you're not able to patch it, because that's just not, you're not a programmer, instead of just complaining about it, actually try to be as detailed as you can about what it is that you think is wrong and what you would propose as a better approach. I think that's a lot more effective than just saying your code sucks. No one wants to hear that, but I think most people in the community are willing to accept valid criticism, so valid suggestions of making something better. So I would do that, you know, through the OpenStack mailing list for sure. I would certainly do that. When you go to user groups, typically there will be people who are in the community who are developers or vendors.
Mm-hmm.
You can always talk to them and say, hey, I was trying to do this on OpenStack and it doesn't work. And here's why I need this feature, and explain it. And then a lot of times, if it sounds good, the vendor will try to champion your cause for you.
Could I add
Awesome.
one other quick thing?
Thank you very much. That was great.
We'll be around after.